Imagine walking through the streets of modern Italy, the narrow alleys of Rome, the ancient stones beneath your feet, the massive ruins of a civilization that once ruled half the world. Everywhere you look, there are reminders of the Roman Empire. But here is the real question. Not about the buildings, not about the history books. The real question is about the people. Are the people living in Italy today actually the descendants of the ancient Romans? At first, the answer seems obvious. Of course they are. After all, Rome was the heart of the Roman Empire for centuries. Millions of people lived there. They built cities, roads, aqueducts, and monuments that still stand today. So it would make sense that modern Italians are simply the continuation of those same people, right? But what if that story is completely wrong? What if the DNA of modern Italy tells a very different story? A story of migrations, invasions, and populations that changed again and again over thousands of years. A story where the original Romans might not even be the majority anymore. And when scientists finally started analyzing the DNA of ancient skeletons buried across Italy, the results shocked historians, because the truth about Roman ancestry is far more complicated than anyone expected. To understand this mystery, we have to go back thousands of years before the Roman Empire even existed. Long before Caesar, long before the Colosseum, long before Rome became the center of the world. Because the people who first lived in Italy were not Romans at all. They were something completely different. More than 8,000 years ago, the Italian peninsula was home to early farming communities. These people were among the first agricultural societies in Europe. They farmed wheat. They raised animals. They built small villages across the land that would later become Italy. But genetically, these early farmers were not originally from Italy. They had migrated from Anatolia, a region that today belongs mostly to modern-day Turkey. This was part of a massive migration that spread farming across Europe. So already, the first major population of Italy came from somewhere else. But that was only the beginning, because around 5,000 years ago, a second massive migration arrived, and these newcomers would dramatically change the DNA of Europe forever. These migrants came from the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea, a region known as the Eurasian Steppe. They were horse riders, warriors, nomadic tribes who traveled across huge distances with their animals and wagons. Today, scientists believe these people were connected to the early Indo-European language family, the ancestors of many modern European languages. When these steppe populations moved into Europe, they mixed with the existing farming populations, and this mixture eventually formed many of the ancient European cultures we know today. Italy was no exception. Over centuries, waves of migrations reshaped the genetic makeup of the peninsula. By the time the early Iron Age began, Italy was already a melting pot of different populations. But one civilization would soon rise above the rest, a mysterious culture that played a huge role in shaping Rome itself, the Etruscans. Before Rome became powerful, central Italy was dominated by a civilization called the Etruscans. They built cities. They had complex religion. They developed advanced art and architecture. In many ways, early Rome borrowed heavily from Etruscan culture. Even Roman kings were once Etruscan. For centuries, historians debated where the Etruscans came from. Some ancient writers believed they migrated from Anatolia. Others believed they were native to Italy. But when modern geneticists finally tested ancient Etruscan DNA, they discovered something surprising. The Etruscans were genetically very similar to other populations already living in Italy. In other words, they weren't foreign invaders. They were mostly local people. Which means that when Rome eventually rose to power, it wasn't replacing a completely different civilization. It was building on top of one that was already genetically similar to itself. But then something happened that would completely transform the population of Italy. Rome began to expand, and with expansion came something that would change the DNA of the empire forever: migration. At its peak, The Roman Empire controlled nearly the entire Mediterranean world, from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Middle East. This meant one thing: people were constantly moving: soldiers, merchants, slaves, administrators, traders. The city of Rome itself became one of the largest and most diverse cities on earth. Historians estimate that during the height of the empire, Rome may have had over 1 million residents, but many of them were not originally from Italy. In fact, ancient records show that huge numbers of people came from across the empire: North Africa, Greece, the Middle East, the Balkans, even regions as far as Syria and Anatolia. The Roman Empire was not just a political empire, it was a giant mixing machine for human populations, and this had a massive impact on the DNA of the city. When scientists analyzed skeletons from the imperial period in Rome, they found something astonishing. Many individuals buried in Roman cemeteries had genetic ancestry linked to the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. In other words, during the peak of the Roman Empire, the population of Rome itself had already become extremely diverse. The idea that Rome was purely Italian was already beginning to disappear. But the biggest genetic transformation of Italy was still yet to come, because after centuries of dominance, the Roman Empire began to collapse. And when the empire fell, new populations flooded into the peninsula, populations that would once again reshape the DNA of Italy. For centuries, the Roman Empire looked unstoppable. Its armies were legendary. Its roads connected continents. Its cities were the most advanced in the ancient world. Rome wasn't just a city anymore, it was the center of civilization. But by the 4th century, cracks had begun to appear: economic problems, political chaos, civil wars, and most importantly, pressure from outside. Beyond the borders of the empire, massive movements of people were beginning. Entire tribes were migrating across Europe. Some were fleeing other invaders. Others were searching for land, and many of them were looking at the Roman Empire as an opportunity. Then in the year 476 AD, something happened that historians still debate today. The Western Roman Empire collapsed. The last Roman emperor in the West was removed from power, and suddenly Italy, the heart of Rome, was no longer the center of a massive empire. It was vulnerable, and that vulnerability opened the door to new rulers. One of the first groups to take control of Italy were the Goths. They were Germanic tribes who had already fought both against and alongside the Romans for centuries. Eventually, under the leadership of their king Theodoric, the Ostrogoths established a powerful kingdom in Italy. For a moment, it almost seemed like the Roman world might survive. The Goths adopted many Roman customs. They governed using Roman laws. They preserved much of the old administrative system, but genetically and culturally, they were different from the people who had lived in Italy before. Their arrival added another layer to the already complex population of the peninsula. And they wouldn't be the last, because soon another wave of newcomers arrived, a group that would leave an even deeper mark on Italy's genetic history. In the year 568 AD, a new force entered Italy. They were called the Lombards. Originally from northern Europe, the Lombards were another Germanic group. But unlike previous invaders, they didn't just rule Italy. They settled across large parts of the peninsula. They established towns, they created kingdoms, and they mixed with the local population. Modern DNA studies of Lombard cemeteries reveal something fascinating. Many Lombard individuals buried in Italy show clear genetic connections to northern and central Europe. But over time, later generations buried in the same cemeteries show increasing levels of local Italian ancestry. Which means something important happened. They didn't remain isolated. They mixed. Slowly but surely, the newcomers and the local populations blended together. Another genetic layer was added to Italy. And again, the identity of the peninsula shifted. But history still had more changes in store, because Italy would continue to experience waves of migration for centuries. After the Lombards, Italy became a battlefield for competing powers. The Byzantines fought to reclaim parts of the old empire. The Franks invaded from the north. Later, the Normans arrived in southern Italy. Originally Vikings who had settled in northern France, the Normans were fierce warriors and skilled rulers. By the 11th century, they had conquered large areas of southern Italy and Sicily, and once again a new population entered the Italian gene pool. But perhaps one of the most fascinating genetic influences came from the Mediterranean itself, because southern Italy and Sicily were deeply connected to the wider world. Greek colonies had existed there for centuries. Then came Arab rule in parts of Sicily. Trade networks linked Italy with North Africa and the Middle East. Merchants, sailors, pilgrims, all moving across the Mediterranean, all contributing to the population. Over time, the Italian peninsula became one of the most genetically diverse regions in Europe. And this diversity was not random. Different parts of Italy began developing slightly different genetic identities. Northern Italy, Central Italy, Southern Italy, each with its own unique mixture of ancestry. But this raises an important question. After thousands of years of migrations, invasions, and mixing, what happened to the original Romans? Did their DNA disappear, or are they still there, hidden within the modern population? To answer that question, scientists turn to one of the most powerful tools in modern history research, ancient DNA. Until recently, historians could only guess what ancient populations looked like genetically. But today, technology allows scientists to extract DNA from ancient skeletons. By comparing ancient DNA with modern populations, researchers can track how populations changed over time. And when scientists began analyzing skeletons from different periods of Roman history, they discovered something astonishing. The population of Rome changed dramatically multiple times. During the early Roman Republic, the genetic profile of people living in Rome looked very similar to other populations in central Italy. But during the height of the Roman Empire, the DNA shifted significantly. Many individuals showed ancestry from the eastern Mediterranean. This confirmed what historians had long suspected. Rome had become a global city. People from across the empire were living there. But the biggest transformation happened after the fall of the empire. During the early medieval period, the DNA of people in Rome began shifting again, this time toward northern and central European ancestry, exactly what you would expect if groups like the Goths and Lombards had settled in the region. In other words, the population of Rome had changed multiple times over the centuries, and each change left its mark on the DNA of modern Italians. Which brings us to the final mystery. When scientists compare the DNA of ancient Romans to modern Italians today, how much of that original Roman ancestry is still there? Is it a majority, a minority, or something far more complicated? The answer is surprising, and it completely changes the way we think about the Roman Empire's legacy. For centuries, people assumed the answer was simple. Modern Italians must be the descendants of the ancient Romans. It seemed obvious. After all, Rome never disappeared from the map. Cities were never completely abandoned, and millions of people continued living across the Italian peninsula. But when scientists finally compared the DNA of ancient Romans with modern Italians, the results told a far more complicated story, a story that challenges the idea of a single, continuous Roman population. Because the truth is this: modern Italians are not the same people who lived in Rome 2,000 years ago. They are the result of thousands of years of migrations, invasions, and mixing, and the DNA evidence makes that very clear. When researchers analyzed ancient skeletons from the Roman Republic and early Roman Empire, they discovered that these individuals had a genetic profile similar to other Mediterranean populations. But when scientists compared those ancient genomes with modern Italians, they noticed something interesting. Some Roman ancestry is still present today, but it's not the full story. Instead, modern Italians carry a mixture of several different ancestries. Three major genetic layers dominate the population. 1. Early European farmers who migrated from Anatolia thousands of years ago too. Steppe-related ancestry from Bronze Age migrations 3. Later influences from various Mediterranean and European populations. Ancient Roman ancestry is part of this mixture, but it is only one layer among many. In fact, researchers estimate that modern Italians share roughly 30% to 60% genetic continuity with ancient populations of central Italy, including those who lived during early Roman times. That means a significant portion of ancient Roman ancestry still survives. But a large percentage of the population's DNA comes from later historical events, and those events reshaped Italy again and again. One of the most fascinating discoveries from modern genetic research is that Italy is not genetically uniform. Instead, there is a clear difference between northern and southern Italy. Northern Italians tend to show stronger genetic connections to Central and Northern Europe. This likely reflects the influence of historical migrations such as the Lombards, Goths, and other Germanic groups who settled in the north after the fall of Rome. Southern Italians, on the other hand, often show stronger genetic links to the Eastern Mediterranean. This reflects centuries of contact with Greek colonies, Byzantine influence, and trade across the Mediterranean world. Sicily and southern Italy, in particular, have a very complex genetic history. Their populations show influences from Greeks, Arabs, Normans, and other Mediterranean cultures. In other words, Italy is not the genetic continuation of a single ancient population. It is the result of many civilizations layered on top of each other, each wave leaving its mark on the people who live there today. Even the city of Rome itself has changed dramatically over time. During the Roman Empire, Rome was one of the most cosmopolitan cities on earth. People arrived from every corner of the empire. Soldiers stationed far from home, merchants trading goods from distant lands, slaves brought from conquered territories. All of them became part of the population. This means the ancient Romans themselves were already genetically diverse. And after the fall of the empire, the population changed again as new groups settled in Italy. So the idea of a single, pure Roman lineage simply doesn't exist. The Roman Empire was always a mixture of peoples, and modern Italians are the descendants of that mixture. So, what is the final answer? Are the ancient Romans still alive today? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, because many modern Italians still carry genetic ancestry from the ancient populations who lived in Italy during Roman times. Their DNA still survives, but also no, because the people living in Italy today are not identical to the Romans of 2,000 years ago. They are something new, a population shaped by centuries of history, by migrations, by invasions, by trade, by empire, and by the endless movement of people across continents. The Romans did not disappear, but they also did not remain unchanged. Instead, they became part of a much larger human story. The Roman Empire may have fallen more than 500 years ago. Its armies are gone, its emperors vanished into history, but its influence never truly disappeared. Roman law shaped modern governments. Roman roads connected continents. Roman culture influenced languages, architecture, and politics across the world. And even in the DNA of modern people, a small part of Rome still remains. Hidden within the genetic code of millions, a silent reminder that history is never simple. Civilizations rise, empires fall, but the people of the past never truly vanish. They simply become part of the generations that follow. And somewhere, in the streets of modern Italy, walking past the ruins of the Colosseum, living ordinary lives in an extraordinary place, the distant echoes of ancient Rome are still there, not just in the stones, but in the people themselves.